My name is Dennis Chaffee. I direct the Teaching and Learning Collaborative. I have a very short task in front of me. The first thing is to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come here today. I also want to thank the Teaching and Learning Collaborative staff, without whom this day doesn't happen. They've put a tremendous amount of work into this. I have a minute-by-minute schedule in my hand from them. We're going to throw that out, of course, and spend more time listening to people, I think. And then the third thing I need to do is to introduce the provost. I just want to tell you that we had an interesting conversation this morning with the speakers, and the provost talked not just about teaching and learning, but about the future of universities. And I think he'll reprise some of those comments. Steve?
What a great crowd. Thank you for coming. This is a huge turnout for Teaching Day. Teaching Day has been remarkably successful here at GW since we created it. I always want to make sure that every day is Teaching Day, of course, at a university. It should be. But there are times when it's worthwhile to come together and specifically focus on how we can bring in expertise to then reflect back on how we as a faculty, staff, and a student body can improve teaching and learning here at the university. But I certainly don't want to get us into a situation where we think about teaching once a year. That's obviously not where we want to be. So today I'm delighted to welcome our guest speakers. We have two outstanding scholars who are here to give their perspectives that will help inform us about our thinking about teaching and learning. First is Dr. Anders Ericsson from Florida State University, and the second speaker is Dr. Keith Sawyer of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We did have an interesting breakfast conversation with them this morning, a small group of us, and I'll actually sort of reflect a bit about what some of that conversation was. The heart of the conversation was, how do the changes in what we know about learning and what's happening in the external world from us, what does that inform us about the future of universities, and particularly universities like ours? We are fundamentally, at our core, a residentially based university with a dual mission of teaching and research, quite typical for great universities of our type, and certainly from the universities that our guest speakers come from. It is a relatively recent invention, the university of that type. Of course, universities always had researchers in them, but in the United States, it's really a post-World War II phenomenon. When Vannevar Bush conceptualizes this incredible private-public partnership between the universities of the United States and the federal research enterprise, and that then drives a rapid growth in universities' engagement in sponsored research. Vannevar Bush is informed of that by his experiences in World War II, in which universities became the home for key research activities. Most notably, for example, radar. So radar is invented, actually not in the United States, so probably fundamental work gets done in Great Britain. Great Britain, of course, is under massive attack from Nazi Germany. The United States either is expecting to enter the war, or later enters the war, ramps up, and has several thousand people who work on radar research on the MIT campus, with the cryptic name the Radiation Laboratory, which they think actually, someone genius thought that would actually fool spies into, But leaving aside that sort of fantasy, and so our university, and university like ours in the United States, are outcomes of that history. So what does it mean, though, for teaching and scholarship? We made the case that there is an important synergy between the modern research university and the teaching mission of the university. But a lot of what we're seeing today is being to question not so much that partnership between teaching and research, but the modalities in which we teach. And so the questions we're being forced to ask, and I recounted a story. I was meeting with, I meet regularly with about 13 other provosts of universities like ours, large to medium-sized private universities, mostly from the sort of east of the Mississippi. And we get together and without a lot of formality, and twice a year we have about a day and a half of really fantastic conversations. And in one of those meetings, one of the provosts recounts a story, which is he's been asked by his trustees to come talk to their trustees, and the questions he's being asked is, in the face of essentially very low or no cost online education opportunities, what's the future of their university? And is there this existential threat to the model? And so we actually had probably an hour and a half long conversation amongst, because all of us, many of us had not been asked that question yet, but we certainly all anticipated someday someone asking that. And we are, and it may be our complete fantasy, of course, because we're all heavily committed to the modern residential-based private university model, but we all came to the conclusion that there are important questions that it will force us to ask, but that it probably isn't an existential threat if we ask ourselves those questions, which of course we'll tell you about, if we ask ourselves those questions and address them. And so here's the way I think the conversation went. Basically, we need to understand and amplify the value proposition to our students of a residential-based education. And that means we need to articulate better the types of things that we believe they should be able to learn and be able to do when they graduate. And the fortunate thing is that for particularly undergraduate education, and let me focus particularly on undergraduate education right now, the truth is, although many of us haven't thought about it or articulated it, the types of outcomes we expect only partially relate to what we do in classrooms. So if one thinks of a education at a place like GW or any one of the peers, we're not unique in this, as a bundle of credits, well, that's the most extreme caricature, right? The idea is you come here and you get a bundle of credits, credit hours, and you leave and we give you a degree. And if you think that's what we do, you do have to wake up at night and ask, why does anybody spend the sort of money that our students and their parents commit for a bucket of credits? When in fact, there are lots of bucket of credits. And if you particularly characterize it even more unfairly and say, not only is it a bucket of credits, but it's you're sitting in a lecture hall listening to somebody, and that's how you get most of your bucket of credits. Well, if that's the model, we got deep problems. And fortunately, I don't believe it is. We need to conceptualize what we do as a holistic experience, informed in part by what happens in the classroom, but also the totality of an undergraduate's experience here. And what they learn is not just what happens in the classroom. Now, we have to be more deliberative about that. We have to communicate that to our students. We need to get them to reflect more. Those of you who hear me talk many other times, I talk about the need for students to reflect on what they do outside the classroom and make that part of the educational experience. So that's the first piece of what we need to do. We need to fully integrate what we think of as the co-curricular or non-curricular activities and reconceptualize them as part of the education experience and help our students learn from them attributes and skills, in fact, that we're not very good at teaching in the classroom. And then the second part of what we need to do to make sure that we actually are relevant in a future world in which much of the things we think of as the things we lecture about are actually available online, probably get lectured by someone who does it better than we do, on average, is to think about how we teach in the classroom. That is, make that time for the student a time in which they're learning. So questions like, why do we lecture at all? Is there value to that shared performance experience, particularly in a large lecture? And I have to say I'm somewhat skeptical about the lecture as a learning modality. That if all we do is lecture, we're going to have a point at which students discover and figure out that there's actually people who do it better on average than we do. So one challenge is, how do we take what we know about learning, minimize the amount of lecturing we do, and maybe eventually eliminate it? One person at breakfast speculated that at some point in time, the lectures simply will disappear from modern higher education as a learning modality, a teaching modality. So how do we use what we know about learning and how students learn, what they retain, what we want them to do, to maximize the value of the time we do spend with them? In very simple terms, again, oversimplifying the term flipping the classroom, in which we sort of create an expectation that students will go online or however, hear or watch people either lecture or read about it, and then we'll use our class time with them for the sorts of deep inquiry and critical thinking and conversation that is very hard to replicate in a pure online experience, other than by bringing people together online, which is simply a distance learning version of what we would do in a seminar or classroom. So I think one of our challenges is to think much more deliberately about, if we're going to continue to have classes and courses, and I believe we should do so, what do we do in them? And how do we feel comfortable that that time commitment of our time and their time, the students' time, is actually worth it? And that they're actually learning something that really requires that face-to-face, in-residence contact. Because the truth is, that's the expensive part of an education, higher education today. But I believe it's of enormous intrinsic value. We just have to do it right, and we have to do it well. So how does learning science, how do things we know about how people learn inform that? We know some things, and our speakers will certainly elaborate more. But again, I'm not an expert in this field, but as I understand it, first of all, we know that particularly with respect to expository knowledge, there's a component of use it or lose it. In that, and we all know this, right? Our students forget a lot. Some of you may have seen the old Saturday Night Live sketch in which Guido Sarducci, the character played by Guido Sarducci, describes the 5-minute university, I think it is a 10-minute university, in which he sort of says, you major in Spanish. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Okay, that's all you remember anyway. And he goes through and does this, and he says, another 5 minutes, I can give you a graduate degree. And he's characterizing, of course, the fact that what we teach is different from what they learn, and what the students learn, in fact, is different from what they retain. So one aspect we need to think about pretty deliberatively is, what is the thing we want them to retain, and how do we help them retain it? And I think there is some evidence that without practice, without repetition, without reminding, without sort of reinforcement, a lot gets lost from the day we give the last lecture or they take the final to even a year later, let alone 5 years or 10 years later when they're actually trying to apply this knowledge. The second thing is, you survey students, and this I've actually done, so I'm not an expert in it, and you just ask them, reflect on how you learned and rank these things that you did in higher ed in your education by what you believe, and of course what they believe may not be true, but it's interesting to ask them, what contributed most to your learning? And it's pretty depressing how far down the list lectures are, right? Lectures tend to come in well in the bottom of that list. Their internship, their undergraduate research experience, a great seminar. It's rarely lectures that they tend to list. Now, there's two possibilities. Either A, they're wrong, which we should entertain as a possibility, or B, we're wrong. I mean, if those of us who are committed to the lecture as probably the sole, the dominant way of teaching. But my guess is they sort of got it right. That if you really think deeply about the great lectures you saw, you remember pieces of it, it's fragmentary, it's sort of a little like remembering a childhood. You remember sort of what you thought you remember or what you told yourself you remembered. Half the time it might be wrong. My guess is their experience in our lectures are sort of like that. So there's great challenges for us. How do we take what we know about what students learn, how students learn, how people learn, not even just our students, and how do we use the insights we're beginning to get, even in this early stages, about learning sciences and other disciplines, and how do we translate those into concrete changes in how we teach our students? Each of us needs to sort of face that challenge and ask ourselves, one of the things sometimes it's worth asking yourself after you come out of a classroom is saying, was that time well spent? What do I expect my students actually know now or can do now as a consequence of having spent 1, 2, or 3 hours with me in a classroom? Just reflect on that occasionally and ask, was that the best use of their time and my time to contribute to their learning? And sometimes the answer is pretty encouraging, when you have a great seminar and students are deeply engaged and you really feel like they're thinking as participants. And sometimes the answer in my experience is, well, maybe that wasn't the best hour and a half I ever spent with them. But we should be asking ourselves of that, because the challenge for us is almost existential, which is, I believe there is a path forward, a very positive path forward for the modern residentially based undergraduate experience, but only if we are willing to think reflectively and change. That if we believe we can continue to do what people have been doing for the last 100 years in classrooms, we may be sorely mistaken. And even if people lecture well, one of the stories I don't tell is, so let's think about, again, lecturing as the modality. Even the great lecturers, and there are some out there, of course, we always remember somewhere, some point in time, some moment, the last buggy whip manufacturer went out of business in the United States. I can promise you they made a great buggy whip. They were great at it because, frankly, all the other ones died before they did. It was really a good buggy whip. The problem, of course, is nobody needed a buggy whip anymore. I don't think that's higher education's future, but I do think it could be the future if we're cavalier about what we do in the future. So it's a real challenge for us. It's an exciting challenge. I actually don't lose sleep over it. I do think it's exciting. I think with all these sort of existential threats, there really are opportunities. There are opportunities to get better. So I invite you to engage in that. Today is just part of that process. Think reflectively about what our guest speakers have to say and how it might affect how you teach and how our students learn. Come away perhaps with a few things you want to do differently or can do differently. And of course, continue the conversation with your colleagues in your departments and homes. So welcome to Teaching Day, and I'm looking forward to it. Take care.
I'm Steve Ehrman. I'm the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning. I'm delighted to be with you, and I've been asked to say a few things. I have a pesky memory for at least a few cartoons that I've seen. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to actually find the cartoon to show you, so I'm going to have to ask you to imagine it. So this is the first two frames of the cartoon. And visualize this as a hologram above my head in vivid color with the parents moving and the Christmas tree and the lights glowing. It's the middle of the night, the box is there. They got the instructions out. They're trying to read it. I mean, you can see it. Maybe you've been there. So step one, get a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. We said simple, we didn't say easy. I think everybody in this room would agree. That's why you're here. Teaching isn't easy. But it has been my experience over 40 years or so of talking to faculty that there is some disagreement about whether teaching is simple or not. Another cartoon. Again, this is one I actually saw in the newspaper years ago. So these are the two views, and I'm talking now not just about my observations, but about any number of books, articles, empirical research studies about the difference between faculty who think that teaching is simple and those who think that it's not so simple. I think you'll recognize the view on the left. I suspect nobody in this room probably holds it, but that the job of the faculty member is to organize and present content, and whether learning happens or not is the responsibility of the students. A faculty member, one of our colleagues, said to me about a year ago as we were talking, the success of students in my class is basically determined by the trajectory they were on when they arrived at George Washington University. And this kind of view, among other things, says that when student learning gets better in my class, it's because, great, we're admitting better students. If it gets worse, contrary-wise, if two faculty members are teaching different sections of the same course and one set of students get better grades, that must be grade inflation going on. I mean, there are a number of things that go along with this, and I don't think anybody would think, oh gosh, nobody at all that I've ever met thinks those things, but that's the view that it's simple. Again, the not so simple, I think, probably embraced by everybody in this room, and it's why people come to events like this. For people who think it's not so simple, the act of trying to improve teaching is an act of lifelong learning. I won't rehearse why, what the factors are behind that. What I would like to do is to take a couple minutes before introducing our speaker to say a little bit about what over the last couple of years we've been developing, actually, and even longer than a couple of years, what we've been developing here at GW as resources for people who think that teaching is not so simple and that it's a lifelong activity to get better at it. We've organized a coalition for teaching support. It's not a name we've tried to publicize particularly. It's kind of like a secret club for those who are in it. But the people who are in it are individuals and leaders of units who have in common that they have some sort of a formal responsibility for helping faculty teach better or to in some way or another influence teaching. So some of the members are units with university-wide responsibilities like the Teaching and Learning Collaborative or the Writing Intensive course program that is part of the university writing program. There are some people with school-specific responsibilities. I see Jack Brosco in the audience who works with CPS. There are campus-specific people in it. For example, a librarian at Eccles on the Mount Vernon campus. Some of these units are pretty multi-purpose. They provide assistance and support in a variety of ways. Again, the TLC would be an example of that. Some are highly targeted. Maurice Smith, for example, in Academic Service Learning or the Multicultural Center, they too have agendas having to do with helping faculty to teach in certain ways or in certain kinds of circumstances. As I mentioned, some are multi-person offices, others individuals. A lot of them are staff members, members of the Coalition for Teaching Sports. Some are faculty who have, for example, responsibilities as chairs of committees that deal with teaching in their particular schools. These are just a few of the groups that are in the CTS, and it's a pretty large operation. I did want to especially mention that one of those units, the Instructional Technology Laboratory, which you probably know is in the basement of Gelman. It's a facility specifically for faculty to learn about using technology in particular ways for particular kinds of teaching tasks. It's also a wonderful space. It's just been enlarged, so if you just need a quiet space to go and grade some papers or contemplate and so on without being disturbed too much, it's a nice place to go for that too, and they're reopening their facility at 4 o'clock next Wednesday. So give them a call, let them know you're coming so they don't have much to provide in the way of refreshments, and you can talk to the provost there. It'll be 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So there are 44 units, 44 different operating units, some of which one person, some multi-persons in the CTS. That's about 100 staff and faculty, part-time, full-time, all of whom have a responsibility for helping you all teach better or teach in certain ways. And it's kind of a wonderful thing to think about that. We're a big institution, but there are a lot of people out there who in various ways are there to help you out. You can find out more about the CTS and what it has to offer by going to that web link, go.gwu.edu/CTS. You'll find, for example, there a long list of different kinds of resources on the GW website that are resources and services having to do with teaching. One of them is a page that's in particular about grants that GW makes. Different units of GW make available for different purposes. It's an incomplete list. It doesn't, for example, talk about what the deans and department chairs might make available, but there are a lot of other sources too, including my office. And I can't leave this slide without mentioning what is go.gwu.edu. How many people already know what go.gwu.edu is? Hands? Good, then I'm performing a public service. Go.gwu.edu was developed by somebody wonderful at GW. I have no idea who. I stumbled across it myself. It is a tool that GW makes available to anybody who has a GW email account to create aliases for long URLs. Now, the URL for the CTS is actually much longer than that. The URL for that grants page is even longer. It's probably 50 characters long. But, you know, you've got a slide up. You want your students to copy down a URL. You've got a paper handout. How do you get that across to them in a way that's so short that when they copy it, they won't make any mistakes? If you remember go.gwu.edu, all you really need to remember is either CTS or grants, and you've got the whole URL. Well, you just go to that website, go.gwu.edu. It'll ask you for your email, your net ID and your password, and there'll be a page there, and you just paste in the long URL, and it'll either give you a random set of characters for the alias, or you can make it up, something memorable like grants. Got a secret for you. You can only use these once. I already grabbed grants, so you can't use it for anything else. Unless you come to me and offer me a certain consideration, then I might let you have that. I might let you use it instead. But because not many people know about this, notice nobody in this room knew about it yet. It means that you might have one, let's say you've got a personal web page and your name is Bob. I'm guessing go.gwu.edu/Bob is not used yet. There's also something else wonderful about this if you have used services like this, which is suppose that we moved the URL. We have now a new page for the grants for the under the CTS collection. I can log in as myself since I grabbed grants, and change the page to which it points. So you're not paralyzed once you have this. It's not now permanently pointed someplace. You can repoint it to wherever you like, which is why I mentioned the part about the consideration if you wanted to use that page again. The Teaching and Learning Collaborative, which Dennis Chaffee heads, is one of the units of CTS. I just wanted to mention a few of the things that it makes available to you, and I'm just going to let you read this slide for the most part. I did want to mention the 3 bottom bullets there in particular, because maybe it's a little less likely you'd know what they are. We're doing an expanding amount of stuff in the TLC with electronic portfolios, and this has involved conversations with faculty from a number of schools recently about what kinds of software are available for that, but there are, I think, a lot of other things we need to be working on as an institution in order to help both students and faculty become more conscious of how students are developing, how they learn going from one course to another. And this is a powerful strategy in that area. And so if you're interested in finding out more about that, I would suggest contacting the TLC. Every year we've had more junior faculty than the previous year signing up for a faculty learning community for junior faculty. There's one each spring. And again, if you're a junior faculty member or you know junior faculty in your department who want to develop their skills at education, this is a great way to do that. We had almost 30 junior faculty in it last year and set a record with that, and we're hoping to see more this year. The final thing I'd want to mention in this very incomplete list of what TLC does is peer-reviewed exploration and teaching, or PRET, that Rahul Simha has led the development of. In fact, Rahul's done a number of very valuable things for GW in this direction. Peer-reviewed exploration and teaching is an exercise of faculty working with colleagues on developing a plan for improving something about their class, getting some observation, some coaching, very much in the way that Anders Ericsson was describing, and then help in documenting that so that it potentially, for example, can be used as part of your dossier. So if you're interested in finding out more about that and possibly participating, I would suggest contacting the TLC or Rahul. The CTS, the TLC, other units are not just providing services, they also work on issues. And again, I just want to say this briefly so that you know that it's happening. For example, we've been working hard at trying to improve the environment that affects whether teaching gets better or not. So if you don't know yet, you will, that the provost recently issued a new and I think very nice set of guidelines about the kinds of materials which should go in a dossier for promotion and tenure. And there's now a lot more detail there, a lot more, I think, helpful tips about the kinds of information that can be included to document teaching. You can't reward good teaching if you can't see it, if you don't have evidence about it. We've been trying to work in those directions. A little earlier, and as sort of a foundation for that, the guidelines for annual reports were revised. And we're going to continue to work in that direction to try to help people each year be remembering to collect the kinds of information about teaching which might eventually be helpful in these dossiers. I've already mentioned PRET. We're also going to be trying to provide some help for departments that want help in organizing peer review processes and peer support among faculty around teaching. We've got a task force that's been working on the student feedback tools that are available for getting feedback at the end of a semester and during the semester. We're in the process of bringing the GW Academy for Distinguished Teachers to life, the initial members being drawn from people who've won teaching awards here in the past. In the area of undergraduate research, which is a pretty big priority for our office and improving learning, we have a team of faculty, Rob Donaldson, Margaret Konglevsky, working with Paul Hoyt O'Connor, who's the director of the Center for Undergraduate Fellowships and Research. Using GWork, it's now possible for faculty to get some help in finding students to be undergraduate research assistants to work with them. We've made a fairly large amount of money available to deans so that the provost's office is matching investments that faculty or chairs or deans make in employing students to do undergraduate research. We've been improving the way we collect information about faculty who mentor undergraduate research and how many students are doing it. So we'll be able to see over time whether we're getting better at that. We do a research day each year, as Provost said. Every day is teaching day. I know every day is research day, but we do have research days, formal research days in the spring, and they too have been getting much bigger each year. And you can read the rest of the slide. We'll be doing even some more issues this year with the Coalition for Teaching Support. So I wanted you to know that there is actually quite a lot going on at GW. That's been true for years, but every year it seems to be substantially larger than the year before. I think, by the way, we're not unique in that. My old institution, Prominent Research University, used to have a little bit going on with teaching improvement. When I look at it now, that's multiplied and then multiplied again. So I think universities across the country, compared to, let's say, when I was a doctoral student, are spending vastly more time on supporting better teaching than they were a few years ago. And one final thing, just a nice bit of evidence, I think, about the success of this, and I'm just now going to look at the TLC, the Teaching and Learning Collaborative. There are now over 700 different faculty members and others who've attended at least one event of the TLC. When I first got here 2 years ago, I was asked, isn't it always the same people who always come to these things? And the answer emphatically is no. We have more and more people who are beginning to look into this because they understand that great teaching is not simple. So I'm going to introduce in about one slide and one sentence Keith Sawyer, our second guest speaker, who's going to be picking up a lot of the themes that Anders Ericsson introduced, not least of which is jazz. And I'm really interested to hear how all that ties into creativity. Keith.
Well, thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. Yes, every day is teaching day, but it's a rare day that I get to share the stage with Professor Anders Ericsson, who's one of my heroes, and I very much enjoyed that talk. And I think Rahul Simha and the rest of the team has done a great job in organizing the day, because I believe my comments are going to be completely synergistic and complementary, and specifically with some of the questions that came at the end of Professor Ericsson's talk. What we're looking at is a new kind of society, a new kind of world. This is just in 2010, the cover of Newsweek magazine, Creativity in America. By the way, I love the crayons. The science of innovation, how to reignite our imaginations. You see this increasingly in the popular media and, of course, among the academy and thought leaders, people talking about the fact that we are now in a creative age, an innovation age. We're in a world where the people who are successful, who get good jobs, are the people who actually are creative professionals, people who can add value, who can be adaptive with their expertise. The most cited article in this issue of Newsweek magazine, oh, well, I'll get there in a minute, sorry. So the Innovation Economy Business Week magazine, so this theme, or meme, if you will, has been around for some time. This was back in 2004, the 75th anniversary issue of Business Week magazine, the innovation economy. So we've got this from business people, we got this from the public, and now it's almost 10 years since this cover appeared, where it's widely realized that we now are in a creative and an innovation age. So the challenge for us as educators and us as institutions of learning is captured in the most cited article that was inside that Newsweek special issue, was titled The Creativity Crisis. Does anyone recall this? The Creativity Crisis. So the authors of this article were on the talk shows. I mean, this was just an incredible impact. What this article argues is that we are, of course, in a creative society, which is the cover issue. It's the creativity issue. And the claim of the authors of this article is that schools are failing to generate creative graduates. And if we truly are in a creative age, an innovation economy, then one of the most important things for schools to do would be to prepare our graduates to be able to be creative. And this article claims that's exactly what they're not getting. In fact, they're getting the opposite of creativity, and they argued American creativity is declining. That's why the crayons are getting shorter, and how we can fix it. So that's basically the theme of my talk, the intersection of creativity and learning. And this, again, this is not a new idea just in 2010. I went back to look at, these are, by the way, here we are inside the Beltway, as we say when we're not, maybe you say that here too, inside the Beltway. So I call these inside the Beltway reports. we can call them white papers, but this is a fancy white paper, so it has color. Tapping America's Potential, this was generated by the Business Roundtable. And Business Roundtable represents all these organizations that you see over here on the left side. I guess we're not supposed to call them lobbying organizations, but industry representative groups. We've got the Business Higher Education Foundation, we've got the Council on Competitiveness, we've got the National Defense Industrial Association, right? This is inside the Beltway, right? So these are people who got together and said, we need to tap America's potential, and how? It's the Education for Innovation Initiative. 2005, the most important thing we can do to tap America's potential is to educate for innovation. Same year, the Council on Competitiveness came up with the National Innovation Initiative Summit, and this is the report that resulted, called Innovate America. So again, this is back, remember Business Week magazine, 2004, we've got Newsweek magazine, 2010, here these reports are coming out, 2005. So how would we make America innovative? Well, there's a lot of recommendations, but the #1 recommendation up at the top is educate next generation innovators, right? Same thing as the Business Roundtable. You get all of these inside the Beltway thought leader organizations coming up with the same recommendation. If we want to be successful as a country, as an economy, we need to be a creative economy, and we need our citizens and our workers to be innovative and creative. And the way to do that is somehow through the schools, right? Somehow through the way we're going to be educating them. Also in 2005, this report may be more widely known among educators, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, Energizing and Employing America for a Brighter Economic Future. So this language of sort of threat, right? The gathering storm means there's a threat coming, we need to respond somehow. All right, this language goes all the way back to 1983, right? The challenge of our education system. So these reports, I've read them closely and I tend to agree with them. I mean, they say things we can all agree with. They advocate for better K through 12 education. So yeah, we can all agree with that. We need better K through 12 education. They advocate for increased higher education quality and funding. So of course, we're all on board with that. They advocate for increased research and development funding, widely recognized to be a critical source of societal innovation. And of course, in the academy at Research University, we can agree with that. There's some other things in these reports that are really about the rest of the economy. We need certain kinds of intellectual property protection. We need certain kinds of tax credits, for example, for research and development expenditures. And these sorts of things I think are widely accepted as well. I mean, you saw the list of organizations supporting these reports. But what's missing, when I look through all of these as a learning scientist and a creativity researcher, these people are at the policy level, the 30,000-foot level, right? And they're policymakers talking about the big issues. What they don't talk about is how will we do it, right? There's no understanding of how innovation works in any of these reports. There's no attention to how people learn for creativity, and there's no attention to how to redesign schools. So now it comes down to us. If the policymakers, I guess, they lay out the policy and they say what's important, and then it's people like ourselves who, well, if we believe what they're saying, then we're the ones who need to make it happen. And people like my own research community of learning scientists and creativity researchers, there's a hunger for information about what would we do if we really wanted to design learning environments to foster greater creative learning outcomes. So that's going to be the theme of my talk. I guess I'll start by saying a lot of the research, pretty much all the research and creativity that I've read and all of my publications are designed to attack a mythical view of creativity as being based in a lone genius, having a big flash of insight, being the source of creativity. And if you believe that the way society gets innovative is that we tap people who are uniquely capable of having these brilliant insights, and we somehow nurture them and foster them and be careful to listen to their brilliant ideas when they have them, put them in a room by themselves where they can think really big thoughts. That's all the sort of practical implications of this mythical view of creativity being based in the lone genius and the flash of insight. But it turns out it's a complete myth. It doesn't happen that way. It never has happened that way. Creativity is always about groups of people coming together, collaborative groups face-to-face, people interacting with each other over time. Back in the 19th century, they were writing letters back and forth or maybe traveling to Cambridge, England, or then now today we have email and we have the internet. But these connections between people, that's where creative ideas, creative insights come from. And especially if we're talking about innovations that actually change the world. They come from collaborations among people. Collaboration drives all creativity, and all creativity has its source in collaboration. This actually now has become another popular meme with the growth of the internet. I mean, when I started my career, there was not an internet. And now we have the internet. First, what was known as Web 1.0 was the internet is a great way to deliver information from content providers to consumers. One-way transfer, right? And then what got called Web 2.0, still called Web 2.0, is now we're all producers and we're all consumers. There's no one way. It goes every way, right? So this is great, right? It fits right in with my own claim that creativity always comes from collaboration. Everybody is a creator, and everybody's creativity coming together is what's going to drive societal innovation. So these are examples. You know, on YouTube, you don't have video production companies generating YouTube videos. Anybody can generate a YouTube video. What sometimes gets called collective intelligence. My own research, I've focused on face-to-face collaborative groups. I think of them as super creative groups. I got interested in creativity research because I'm a jazz pianist for my whole life, starting in high school. And when I started studying creativity, I was most fascinated by improvisational group creativity. How is it that people can come together when they don't have a plan, they don't have a score that they're going to perform from? So when I first was introduced to jazz, I was in a big high school, and I had been a classically trained pianist and was quite good, and I was the rehearsal pianist for our school's musical of The Sound of Music. So the jazz ensemble needed a pianist, and someone recommended me, so I sounded cool. So the first day at the jazz rehearsal, I sat down at the piano, and the band director put the sheet music in front of me, and I couldn't play it because there were no notes. Anybody who's a jazz musician here, there were no notes on the music staff, and I had no idea what I was getting into. There were chord symbols at the top above the music staff, and I quickly learned that the pianist is supposed to improvise the chord voicings that align with the harmonic structure of the song. You're supposed to improvise all of your own parts, and that's the nature of jazz. So, you know, you all smiling, I can tell you're jazz musicians. So the ones of you who are smiling anyway. It took me 10 years. Here it was. I had been playing classical piano for 10 years. It really did take me almost 10 more years to learn how to play jazz effectively. It was like learning a whole new instrument. And not only are you improvising your own parts, but those of you who participated in this kind of genre of music, it's an ensemble art form. So you are improvising your parts while the other musicians in the ensemble are also improvising their parts. So when you're a beginner, that's incredibly challenging because it's hard enough just figuring out where you're going to put your fingers. And these other people are playing, and you have to somehow align with them. As you reach a certain level of skill, you actually start to seek out the ensemble form because you benefit from what the other musicians are doing. They actually inspire you. You'll hear things that they're doing that will prompt you to do something. The drummer will hit the snare drum in a certain way, and I'll change the way I do my rhythmic voicings. And it's not fun to play by myself anymore. So it's an ensemble art form, people improvising together. That's what I chose to focus my career studying, is this kind of super creative ensemble. I found myself in Chicago for graduate school, and I did, again, something else I didn't know about was Chicago Improvisational Theater. And this is a photo of one of the groups I ended up studying. I did a multi-year study of Chicago improvisational theater groups, and I actually played piano with several of these groups. If you've seen this type of theater, in many of the groups there will be a pianist that does musical accompaniment, often improvising the soundtrack, while the actors on stage are. So it is improvisational for the pianist as well as the actors. But it has the same characteristics of improvisational jazz, where the actors don't know what they're going to perform. They don't have a script. They don't have a director up on front of the stage telling them where to go and what to do. So nobody knows. Even the actors on stage don't know what's going to happen. And yet, a coherent and entertaining performance emerges. So it's that phenomena that I really was driven to study. And the more I studied it, and then I started going out into the business world and the education in schools and finding that a lot of, or pretty much as I concluded, all great creativity comes from these kinds of collaborative groups. The kind of collaborative groups that, in a sense, emulate these sorts of improvisational ensembles They emulate them in the sense that unexpected creativity emerges in a way that no one could have predicted in advance. And I am in a school of education, so I was particularly interested in how this kind of improvisational collaboration might benefit learning. And it turns out this is quite well aligned with learning sciences research about how collaboration and cooperation and conversation among learners contributes to learning. So I began to make the claim that the most effective learning environments are the ones where the teacher is participating with the learners in a kind of collaborative conversation. And the classroom flow is in a sense improvisational, because if we believe in the sort of fundamental tenet of constructivism that deep learning occurs when learners construct their own understanding, if they're constructing their own understanding in a predictable fashion, it's not really constructivist learning, right? In some sense, the process needs to be improvisational. And I often think about it in terms of knowledge building. Teachers and students building knowledge together. The teacher is participating, right, in this kind of process. And ideally, you have unexpected insights emerging. So if this isn't happening in the learning environment, then students probably aren't learning how to be creative, right? They're not learning how to have those unexpected insights and new ideas if they're not having them as part of the learning process. So that's going to be the rest of my talk. What would you do if you wanted to construct that kind of experience in your classroom, in your learning environment? How would you teach and how would you guide your students in learning for creativity? Based on the research in psychology of creativity and in learning sciences. So the big foil for most of us learning scientists is something that we call instructionism, after Seymour Papert, one of the founders of the learning sciences, who's probably best known for developing the Logo programming language at MIT back in the 1970s. So he termed instructionism a cultural model of teaching and learning that is deeply ingrained in our society. And I'm not accusing any of you of necessarily believing in instructionism, but it's the kind of thing our students believe it, our parents of our students believe it. It's just what sort of seems natural and given and unexamined about learning. And the instructionism cultural model has a certain set of characteristics. You start with an assumption about what knowledge is. And in an instructionist cultural model, knowledge is a collection of static facts and procedures. And then the goal of schooling, it's to get the facts and procedures into students' heads. These are all, of course, completely consistent and aligned with each other. The role of teachers, they're the people who know the facts, right, and procedures, and their job is to transmit them. Sometimes instructionism is called transmission and acquisition model of teaching and learning. And then it has implications for how you would design curriculum. Simple facts and procedures are learned first, and gradually more complex facts and procedures. And then assessment kind of falls out from all of these assumptions. You just count up how many facts and procedures have been acquired. That's your assessment. So I'm calling this a cultural model of teaching and learning, which is a little bit of a cartoon perhaps, but I think it's the default paradigm that a lot of the general public tends to bring, especially, and even our students, because this is the way they're getting taught, many of them, in secondary school, right? And they come, and this is what, in many cases, this is what they expect college to look like. But there are all sorts of problems with instructionism. And again, I said this is the foil of learning sciences. So this is perhaps information you've all heard before, because you're the kind of committed educators who actually come to the teaching day, right? The knowledge acquired is relatively superficial, right? I actually ask my students when I teach educational psychology or learning sciences, and I ask them how many, by the way, this was at Washington University in St. Louis. I just a month ago moved to University of North Carolina, and I haven't been teaching there this fall. But at Washington University, one of the top universities in the country, I asked my students, how many of you got an A in a subject and were convinced you didn't understand anything? And they all raised their hands, right? And, okay, retention is very low. Another problem with instruction. I asked my students this question: how many of you got an A in a subject and forgot everything about it a month later? And they all raised their hands. Right? So this isn't, they're getting instructionism, right? Transfer to new situation is weak. They learn it, they can ace the test, but they can't take that information and then apply it in a real-world context, which is, of course, what we hope our education will give them. The ability to integrate knowledge is weak, to connect what they've learned with what they're learning in another course, to make those connections among knowledge, right? That turns out to be quite weak. And critical for creativity, the ability to work adaptively when knowledge is weak. So we know all of this. There's tons of studies that ground all these statements about the flaws of instructionism. And our students know it, right? You're laughing, you know it. So these are the problems with instructionism, and we're specifically not getting any learning for creativity in an instructionist sort of learning environment. So then what would you do? What would you do if you wanted to, let's say, discard instructionism and move towards a more creative learning environment? Well, we actually know quite a bit about that, and I would claim it's grounded in a large body of learning sciences research. First, all of the assumptions that I listed of the cultural model of instructionism, I'm going to go through them again, but put in a different slot filler, right, for the creative teaching. If we were going, let's say we create a new cultural model for teaching and learning. Knowledge, instead of being facts and procedures, is often the term we use as deeper conceptual understanding. A deeper conceptual understanding. The goal of schooling is to prepare students to build new knowledge, right? Not to get facts and procedures in their head, although that might be a necessary step along the way, but the goal is to prepare students to build new knowledge. The role of teachers is a different conception of what teaching is. It's to scaffold and facilitate this collaborative knowledge building. And you have a different notion of curriculum as well. You get integrated knowledge, you're helping students understand the connections among what they're learning, and contextualized knowledge referring to learning how that knowledge is embedded in real-world situations, in real-world context of application. So this would be, I'm going to claim, the sort of learning environment that would tend to result in more creative learning. And then assessment, actually I don't have a whole lot to say about assessment because it's still a cutting-edge area of research. How would you actually assess for these kinds of learning outcomes? It's difficult, and we don't have great assessments yet. So I just put up some buzzwords: formative assessment, authentic assessment. Sure, they won't hurt, right? But but this is still a challenge, getting the assessments right. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what's it going to look like. What are you going to be doing, or what are people doing in classrooms that tend to align with these characteristics, that tend to result in creative learning outcomes? Well, it all goes back to active learning, and you've all heard the term active learning. And the question is, what sort of active learning? And it's completely consistent with Professor Erickson's talk, but the devil is in the details, right? What do you mean? What kind of active learning, right? Sort of generally, you need a learning environment where students are working with and using facts and skills and concepts as they are solving complex real-world problems. So their learning is embedded in the solving of complex real-world problems, not detached from it so that later in their junior or senior year, they can take what they learned 2 years before and apply it to complex real-world problems. But the learning is embedded in the problem solving. Students work in collaborative teams. That almost always results in more enhanced learning outcomes. But why are they in teams? Students are always complaining, probably here, just like at Washington University. Students at a top university like this, they're very good students, and they've all had the experience of having to do all the work for their team, all the other members of whom were lazy, I suppose. And so they tend to not like collaboration. Well, a lot of times, instructors form collaborative teams just because they think collaboration is good, but you really need the challenge, you need the task to be so demanding that no one student could possibly solve the problem alone. So it's the nature of constructing the kind of problem that you pose so that the group is necessary. You can't do it alone. You can't do it with one person. And you have professors who are guiding and supporting students as they are working on these projects and problems. So sort of basics, again, this may not seem that strange to many of you. This is a sort of key notions of what active learning looks like. And the key components of this kind of active learning are you're starting with a problem, sometimes called a design challenge, particularly if it's in a school of engineering. Problem-based learning is the term that tends to get used in science or math instruction. But the key is to start with that problem or a design challenge. And then students explore the problem through inquiry and discussion, right? So they're posed with a problem or a design challenge, and they start working at how to solve it, right? And it's complex and real-world problem, not something you can solve quickly, right? And students are working to find solutions to these problems. The process needs to be guided by the instructor because it's going to be challenging, it's going to be difficult. You can't just assign the problem to the students and then go out and get coffee, right, while they work on it by themselves. But your role is to be there and supporting and guiding this process, right, almost like a coach. I find it works particularly well when students create tangible products that address the problem. And there's all sorts of research showing this in math and science and engineering education, that if there's a tangible outcome, a sketch, a three-dimensional model that students are constructing, that actually enhances learning fairly substantially. And I found this in particular, a research study I've been doing for a few years now, pedagogical strategies at schools of art and design, where it's all about the tangible artifact. Those learning environments are completely consistent with learning sciences research. And part of it is their focus on the creation of the tangible artifact. And in that situation, you have the opportunity for intermediate steps, right? Prototypes, subtests, and they're presented and they are being critiqued. There's constant feedback. Another buzzword, formative assessment, right? That they're getting assessment or feedback during the process, thus enhancing their metacognitive abilities, et cetera. So all sorts of good research basis for this. But it's difficult. So, and I'm going to acknowledge that here in the next couple of minutes. There are many challenges for instructors to this sort of learning environment. It's difficult. It's hard. It's hard to identify a good problem or a good design challenge. And by good, I mean, well, there's all sorts of characteristics. One is students are capable of doing it. However, it's not too easy for students. And yet, it has to result in creative potential, many different solutions, right? In a sense, it's unpredictable and improvisational, as I've been arguing. And while they're doing it, they need to learn the desired learning outcomes that you're supposed to be teaching them. So coming up with problems that do all those things is really hard. And by the way, when problem-based learning first became trendy in science education, the advocates of problem-based learning said the best way to do it is to let the students pick the problem, pick something they care about. So they'd go to their class of 7th graders, and they'd say, what do you care about? And they'd come up with things like pizza. And so then the instructor would work all weekend and come up with, a project-based learning environment about pizza. It's just overwhelmingly difficult for the instructor. And by the way, pizza is one of the less bad things that students might come up with. It's very hard to come up with a good problem. So basically, problem-based learning now, they say, no, you can't let the students pick, right? Because it's hard to get a really good problem. And now, if you're a science instructor, there are textbooks. You can go buy the problem-based science book, and it's filled with great problems that have been tested and assessed in middle school classes, at least. You need to be able to help students learn actively. It's a different pedagogical set of skills than being able to lecture effectively. Walking around, advising, interacting, right? It's a different set of skills, and it's hard. It's hard to do it well. Fostering effective collaboration is a skill set also for the instructor. I mean, a lot of students don't know how to do it. Maybe here at GW, maybe they can do it, maybe not, but certainly if they're middle school kids, all sorts of research shows they don't naturally collaborate effectively. They need a lot of support and scaffolding from the instructor. And then I've been emphasizing the importance of these visible artifacts, but creating shared artifacts is hard. People have to make stuff, right? There are certain skills that are involved in translating your developing conceptual understanding into something that's visible. And that's your job, is to guide them in doing that. And then also your job is to be able to provide those critiques and guide the fellow students in providing those critiques. So these are all very difficult things to do. It's really hard to get it right. And it's very different from instructionism. So that's what I'd argue is sort of in the whirlwind capsule argument of all the research that I've seen in creativity and in the learning sciences. That this is the kind of learning environment that most consistently results in creative learning outcomes. I guess, by the way, I should maybe interject. I get asked a lot about how you would teach students to be creative. And I don't think that's really possible. I don't think creativity is something you can teach. I think if you want creative learning outcomes, you have to change the way you teach in the disciplines, because the disciplinary conceptual understandings that result from your learning environment, your classroom, are going to look different if you want creative learners than they are going to look if you don't care if you have creative learners, if you just want them to regurgitate knowledge. The basis for creative performance is a certain kind of understanding of disciplinary knowledge. So if you want a creative scientist, you need to teach physics in this way. If you want a creative engineer, you need to teach engineering in this way. You can't teach in a big lecture classroom and then add a creativity class to the curriculum where students get 1 hour credit, let's say, in a freshman year seminar or something, like some university. You can't it's not enough to overcome the kind of superficial learning that comes from an instructionist learning environment. The nature of disciplinary understanding has to result from this kind of learning environment, or your students will not be prepared to be creative with that knowledge. So I guess I'm arguing in a sense that creativity is discipline-specific or domain-specific, and I think most of the research would support that. And by the way, completely consistent with Professor Erickson's comments. So vision is taking shape. I've seen a lot of learning environments that are doing very exciting things that are aligned with this. This is right here from the Lemelson Foundation here in DC, and MIT has created the Invent Teams program. This is a secondary school. Anybody heard of this program? If you have kids in high school maybe, or a lot of times when I talk to high school teachers, they'll be familiar with this. So what happens is it's a sort of enrichment program. It's outside of the classroom for the most part, although some science teachers are doing it in classrooms now as part of their classroom curriculum. It has all the characteristics I listed of active learning. Students get together in teams, they come up with an invention, they build their invention, there's a competition. If they win, they get a $5,000 prize. They get their invention publicized. It's authentic, they're creating stuff. I mean, look, they spend all their time making stuff. This is great. This is a wonderful project-based learning environment. That results, I would claim, in creative learning outcomes. This is for primary school kids. It's also a sort of a enrichment activity that is a summer camp invention, and obviously much younger kids. But it's the same notion, bringing groups of kids together to go through this process of actually inventing and creating something as part of a team, solving a real-world problem. All sorts of interesting technologies that are coming out of learning sciences laboratories. A lot of them are technology-based. Mostly I'm not that excited by the online delivery of lecture as you get from a massively online open courseware, because you're just replicating the most instructionist features of the old-fashioned traditional classroom, the instructionist learning model. That's the wrong way to use technology. The right way to use technology is to somehow capture and deliver is the wrong word, but to create the kind of environments where students are going to be actively participating in project-based learning. So here's a really exciting use is this. Now everybody has these wireless handheld devices. You can buy pretty cheap ones, even if you're in a school, and buy them for everybody in your class, or sometimes they're getting donated by the cell phone providers. And there's this really cool educational software where this is the teacher's screen at the front of the classroom. Each student has a wireless device, and they're all connected with each other, and they've been assigned a project that they're working on together. The teams are forming spontaneously. Those little blue circles, each of the small blue circles is a student, and each of the lighter blue, bigger circles is a group that has formed. So that those are student groups. And as I said, they're forming spontaneously, so the students are moving around. The 5 screens up here at the top, the teacher is able to zoom in on any one student's handheld screen. So those are 5 of the student screens. So this is what I mean. The students are actively engaged in collaborative teams solving a real-world problem. They are being guided and scaffolded by this well-designed sort of software, and the teacher is able to support them in a kind of way that would be difficult with 24 students, right? Zooming in on any one screen, seeing how the groups are forming. I'm just really excited by this kind of technology. Now, this is a great use of technology. Delivering a video lecture, not such a great use of technology. So this sort of thing is happening throughout learning sciences communities. Computer science departments and education schools are coming together to design cutting-edge educational software that's aligned with the science of how people learn. Here's something in the higher education space, the Integrated Teaching and Learning Laboratory at University of Colorado at Boulder. This now is, about 15 years old. They had a situation where their School of Engineering building was ending its lifespan, and they were going to have to build a completely new building. So they went, by the way, this is back in 1997, they went out and looked at the landscape of educational research and learning sciences research, and what I'm telling you now was already sort of mostly known even in the mid-1990s. So they followed the advice, and they said, our new building is going to be completely designed around a pedagogy and a curriculum of group-based, project-based learning. So the new building does not have any lecture halls. So we don't need lectures, right? Because all the research shows lecture is a really bad way for people to learn. They turned completely away from instructionism. They have this huge new facility, which is called the Integrated Teaching and Learning Laboratory, which has in it student group spaces. And they have some small conference rooms along the edge of the space where teams can go if they need some private space. But most of the students are working in a big area that's, you think of it like a gym, a basketball court or an airplane hangar or something. And here's a group of students, everything, all the equipment's on wheels so they can roll it around, reconfigure the space and move it. Yeah, just an incredible transformation from instructionism. They went all the way in, right, all the way in with learning, I would say research-based learning environment, active project-based learning. Okay, so if you believe everything I've said so far, there's more research if you want to follow up on this. It's a challenge to do it. How do we get there from here, I guess, is my question. Because we're all on campuses that have lots of lecture halls. The lecture halls aren't going to go away tomorrow. We have a certain number of instructional staff. We can't really get every classroom to have 20 students in it. That's just not feasible unless we hire double or triple the number of our faculty. So there are all sorts of challenges of how we would make the transition. And I guess I'm going to leave you with a story about, it's a general story about how innovative transformations happen and with implications for what you would all do as the faculty at a top research university. And maybe you'll be surprised that I'm going to tell you a story about a board game. This is the world's best-selling board game. It is Monopoly, right? You've all seen Monopoly. And this is the original edition of Monopoly from 1935. Monopoly was created and sold by Parker Brothers. And the game actually was an incredible success very quickly. It was the height of the Depression, 1935, released in January. By April, it had sold 400,000 copies, 100,000 copies a month. By the end of the year, it had sold 1 million copies. And it doesn't sound like a lot today, I suppose. But back at the time, this was unheard of. No board game had ever sold like that. So it was such a phenomenon that people started talking about the Monopoly craze. And newspaper reporters, they wanted to write stories about the Monopoly phenomenon. And so they actually called up Parker Brothers and said, we'd like to interview the creator of Monopoly for our story. Of course, Parker Brothers loves the publicity, so they trot out Charles Darrow. And here is Charles Darrow playing his game. As Parker Brothers says here, you know, feel free to interview him. He loves being interviewed. And these stories are all over the whole country. If you look at newspapers on microfiche or whatever from 1935, you'll still see these stories about the Monopoly craze. So they said, well, how did you come up with Monopoly? And Charles Darrow is telling the story, and he says he was unemployed. So he said, I'm unemployed, and I had a lot of time on my hands, so I was reading a novel, one of the many books I was reading during my unemployment phase. Lots of people were unemployed. It was the Depression. So he's reading a novel, and it's a novel about a high school kid, this young boy who was attending what was called a Latin school. And the Latin school is college preparatory school. Well, he fails out of the Latin school. He's not college ready. His fallback option is to go to this, what they call a commercial school, where basically they teach these boys some skills about how to be a clerk in a business. So you learn how to write some business letters, you learn about stationery supplies, you learn about negotiating with customers and suppliers, and you're going to get out at 18 and you're going to go work for some business, right? So that's the commercial school. And in the novel Charles Darrow is reading, this boy attending the commercial school, the instructors of the commercial school have created a simulation activity for the students where they have paper money. They've created this paper money and they've created these cardboard stock certificates. And they want the boys to buy and sell stocks with each other. They're going to learn about the stock market. They're going to learn about negotiating. So it makes great sense for this commercial school. So Charles Darrow is reading this novel, and he has the big flash of insight, right? This would make a good board game. So he goes down in the basement. He gets his scissors and colored markers, and he spends some time down in the basement. He makes up Monopoly. He comes back up from the basement, and voila, right? Here it is. So this is in, most of the newspapers in America in 1935. Well, there's just one problem with the story. It's a complete lie. Charles Darrow did not invent monopoly. Right? This is the light bulb flash going off with the solo guy. The real story is a story about how innovation really works and the collaboration and networks that are behind any kind of innovation. And it goes all the way back quite a ways. It goes back to 1879. This is the most famous economist that no one's ever heard of. If anyone knows who this is, I'll be really impressed. Anybody know? He wrote a book called Progress and Poverty in 1879. His name is Henry Lloyd George. Still one of the best-selling economics books of all time. Translated into just about every other language. Very influential. He advocated in Progress and Poverty something that was known as the single tax philosophy. And the single tax was pretty radical because what he advocated for was one tax, only a tax on land. So landowners would pay tax based on the proportion of land they owned. I mean, it gets a little complicated, but basically that's the core of it. People who don't own land don't pay any tax. And by the way, they get free rent. I mean, it's almost like this socialist utopia, right? But as you can imagine, there were many powerful forces arrayed against the single tax, like anybody who owns land. So it never went anywhere. There are, if anybody's from Delaware, there actually are a few little towns in Delaware that were founded as single tax communities. So it actually got to be pretty influential, although it never went anywhere politically. Some of the biggest advocates of the single tax philosophy were the Quakers. And the Quakers, pretty much the entire Quaker community, was huge supporters of the single tax philosophy. And they saw it wasn't going anywhere. By around 1900, Henry Lloyd George ran for office. He never got elected. He died penniless. And around 1903, 1904, there was a Virginia Quaker named Lizzie Magie. And she said, I was going to say damn, but I don't know, Quakers probably didn't swear. She said, darn, this single tax philosophy, it's the way the world should go and nobody's paying attention. I need to convince people of the merits of the single tax system. And I'm going to do it by creating a board game. So she created a board game and got a patent on it in 1904. It was called the Landlord's Game. And here is an image from her patent. You can see where I'm going already, right? And the Landlord's Game in 1904, patented by Lizzie Magie. She took it to Parker Brothers. They said, we're not interested. It sucks. What kind of board doesn't have a start and an end space? All sorts of problems. But she didn't care about the money, right? She just really wanted the single tax system. She published the game with two sets of rules. One set of rules was the current evil capitalist economy, where everybody plays until one person gets all the money and everybody else is bankrupt. And you would play that way and you would learn how wrong it was. Then the other set of rules was the single tax philosophy, where everyone would play the game and they would all sort of get happily comfortable together. And then you would learn the benefits of the single. Well, we know which one stood the test of time. So she started sharing the game with her Quaker friends. And actually, they loved it. It actually caught on in the Quaker community. And people started playing this all up and down the eastern seaboard, and then it made it into the Midwest. You had to make your own copy of the board because you couldn't buy it. So people would make their own copies, and I found these images on the internet. This is a board from Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And what you see is this was 1911. By the time in 1911, people who copied the board, they developed this custom of changing the space names to be streets and neighborhoods in their own city. So this, I believe, is Allentown, Pennsylvania. And 1911, all the spaces are named after streets and neighborhoods in Allentown, Pennsylvania. This is 1916. This is from somewhere else in Bucks County. I just put this one up because this is the playing pieces they used, just sort of thimbles, right, and buttons, because they had to just use what they had lying around the house, because everybody was making their own copy of the game. This is a beautiful edition from 1928. The professor at Columbia University who created this set is Professor Sheldon Stryker. He was a professor of economics, and professors of economics also at the Wharton School would use the Landlord's Game in their classes, actually, to teach economics principles. By now, what you see is colored spaces. And by the way, these are all streets and neighborhoods in and around New York City. You've got the Bowery, you've got Hoboken, you've got Washington Heights, et cetera. So this is the New York version, right? Lizzie Magie's version did not have the option of buying 3 properties of the same color and then charging more money. That was not part of the original rules for the game. The monopoly that it's named after, well, at some point by 1928, it actually was being called Monopoly. And who was the first person to come up with this idea of coloring the spaces in groups of 2 and 3? That's lost to history, right? We don't know that. But it emerged at some point along the way from 1904 all the way to 1935. And then in 1934, Charles Darrow, well, remember Charles Darrow? Charles Darrow, the unemployed, whatever he was unemployed at, some people say radiator or mechanic. He was visiting some Quaker friends in Atlantic City, and they pulled out their copy of Monopoly, and it was the Atlantic City version, which had all of the streets from Atlantic City. And Charles Darrow's playing this game. He says, "This is a great game." And he takes it back to his hometown, I believe was Germantown. He makes a copy of the game. He fraudulently obtains the patent on the game. And then he takes it to Parker Brothers, basically fraudulently sells it to Parker Brothers. And so that's the real story versus the mythical story. So why is it that the mythical story caught on so readily with all these newspaper reporters? There's a myth about how creativity happens. It's deeply ingrained in our culture. I started my talk with it, right? But the reality that comes from the story is the way innovation always happens. We have this myth that it's about the big flash of insight. The reality is innovations emerge over long periods of time. It's never one big idea. It's lots of small ideas that come together over a period of time. We have a myth that it's a straight path to success, right? He's reading the novel. He goes down in the basement. Anytime you hear a story about someone having the idea and developing it all alone, almost always is a false story. And you scratch beneath the surface, you find collaboration over and over again. The reality is multiple dead ends. And here we got this Monopoly story, which is a perfect example where all these different cities all over the country which had different versions of the game. There was the single tax version, which is lost to history. There were versions that didn't have the monopoly function where you could buy 3 properties of the same color, right? All sorts of variations that didn't make it, right? But now we have the one. So it's like hindsight is 20/20 vision, right? You think the straight path to success. It never happens that way. And finally, you think it's about this lone genius. That's the mythical version. But it's always small ideas for many people. So you got small ideas for many people over a long period of time. Lots of them are going to end up being dead ends. So what does this have to do with you and the schools of the future? Well, when I look across the economy, at any sector of the economy, this is where I see innovation happening. This is the process of innovation. I claim it's going to be the process of innovation in institutions of learning, whether they're K through 12 schools or whether they're universities. This is what innovative organizations look like. And I'm talking about the kind of thing that you'll get from professors in the School of Business whose job it is to analyze innovative organizations. They have the characteristics of the 30-year process that resulted in the invention of the board game Monopoly. In innovative organizations, the professionals are continually learning. They're pretty much always working collaboratively. And this is important, they engage in mutual tinkering, where small sparks add up to big ideas. Those small ideas over time coming together are what lead to innovative transformation. It's never about one big idea. If you're waiting for one big idea, it's never going to come. It's about small ideas over time, but if all those small ideas stay isolated, that's not going to change the world either. They have to come together. That's why it's this sort of notion of mutual tinkering. This happens quite a bit in innovative organizations, the changing of assignments in teams and organizations. It gets people exposed to ways of thinking that are different from their own silo, if you will, that are different from their own discipline or their own way of thinking. So this is pretty critical. I know you can't go get tenure in a different discipline. If you have tenure in physics, you're not going to go over and be in English literature, but the more you can learn, even if it's just a little bit, the more helpful it's going to be. So my take-home message, creativity is more important to our students and to our society than at any time in history. And I started out my talk showing that we really have a pretty strong consensus across the leaders of our society that this is what we need. We need creativity, we need innovation, and schools and universities are a critical piece of the solution. And the good news is that we have some great research that shows us how we would give students this kind of knowledge. The kind that really, sometimes you hear about 21st century skills. Well, creativity is absolutely one of those 21st century skills. So we have some research that can help us do that. And just to summarize very quickly, I've told you a lot. but the research is out there. Basically, it's teachers and students collaborating in creating knowledge together. So really, it's about, when I look out at this great room full of talent, if you're all working alone and not sharing your ideas, right, that's not what innovation looks like. You need to be having these small ideas, whatever it is. It's a new way of designing a discussion activity, or it's a new way of developing your assessment at the end of a course. Those are the kind of small ideas. They're little ideas. It's the mutual tinkering. You're only going to do a little bit of tweaks at a time. But then sharing those with your colleagues, and then they build on what you've done and elaborate or enhance with their own idea. What it ends up looking like is, honestly, it looks like group improvisation, right? It's what happens when a jazz ensemble, when a drummer does something new, and then the pianist hears that and responds and builds on that. And over time, you end up with a fascinating performance that no one could have predicted ahead of time. That's the innovation process. But it only happens when people share and collaborate and bring their ideas together. Those ideas coming together over time are what results in substantial change. That's what results in organizational transformation and innovation. So it's really about collaboration. It's about the faculty working together and really looking at everyone in the room, everyone here at GW, as a creator, as a collaborator, someone who is going to be generating those small ideas that you will then hear and build on it. And in a way, I think of it as a collective intelligence or a group genius. So that's my final message, is work with each other, listen to what everybody else is doing, and make sure you're sharing your own creative ideas. Thank you.
Why don't you step here for some questions?
Sure.
I think we've got a little bit of time for questions, and we can actually sit down over here.
Oh, no, can I keep standing?
Oh, yeah, that'd be fine. I wanted to ask the first one, actually. I'm going to take advantage of my position up here. As a professor of psychology, and before then an assistant professor, TA, and so on, you've come through a journey yourself, I would imagine, in how to teach students. And I don't imagine that your ideas when you started were as formed as they are now about how do I educate students to be creative. I'm wondering how it got started, though. Where were you when you very first started to teach in terms of your assumptions and practices about teaching? And what were some of the first fumbling things you did? What worked, what didn't work? How did you get started in a journey that led you eventually to how you teach now?
Right. Well, when I first was hired at Washington University, I honestly did not know how to teach at all. I got my PhD in psychology, and I did my dissertation on children's pretend play, basically developmental psychology. So I was not a member of the learning sciences community. But I had learned enough to know that active, constructivist learning was going to be the most effective. So I started out my classes just by having all the students sit around, and I asked them to do a reading and talk. And that really was not effective. So my whole trajectory of teaching has been one of adding more structure, or what we call scaffolding, right? Mm-hmm. Adding in, designing, now as a learning scientist, I would call it designing the learning environment. Designing the learning environment so that the spontaneous collaborative interactions among the students are more likely to result in the kind of learning outcomes that you want. So for me, it was a long learning process as a practitioner. And then there's the other hat you put on as a learning scientist researcher, mm-hmm. Which I would say the research is consistent with that, right? The most effective learning environments do have quite a lot of structure to them. So like I said, it's not like you go out and get a beer while your students do stuff together. I mean, you're in there actively interacting with them.
And it's things you can do with a big class, 50 students or 100 students, intro psych. I mean, does that influence the way you teach that?
It's tough. I've never taught a class more than 50 students. Uh-huh. So, but we have some, I got to stop saying we about Washington University, sure. Since I've just relocated.
Yeah,
at Washington University, one of my closest colleagues was a professor in the chemistry department who was responsible for their freshman general chemistry, which had 2 sections of 600 students each or something. Mm-hmm. And she had studied all the research. She was actually also head of our teaching center. And one of the things she would do, she would never talk for more than 5 minutes without stopping and engaging the students in some active participatory activity. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you can buy books about this, like the research on how to lecture in a large class effectively. And one of the core findings is don't go for more than 5 or 7 minutes without stopping and engaging the students in something active. And so there are ways to do it. Perhaps I'm not the expert on that, but I can direct you to a source.
Very good. Okay, questions?
I'd like to comment and support your point about mutual tinkering. It is very important. But first I have to make an aside. In the 60s, I was at Boston University, and not at the university, but in Boston. I took a 10-week instructional course in Henry George's Progress in Poverty.
Yay!
So the Quaker groups are still out there probably now in trying to promulgate the very good idea that never went anywhere. I haven't been asked that. Henry George has not come up in conversation in years, so I just had to bring that out. I want to go back to the mutual tinkering. I work in policy, and John Kingdon is someone I'm going to commend to you, who wrote about the process of coming to making policy decisions in Washington in a more functional time than today. But his book essentially describes, and he was observational in interviewing and understanding how policy actually happens. And he totally upset the more conventional, rational, linear process that people had, and argues for essentially a mutual tinkering, tremendous amount of cooperation and collaboration among people, bits and pieces of ideas being bandied about, and eventually one that's more plausible than others, not necessarily perfect, emerging. So John Kingdon also, I think, was onto mutual tinkering, and many policy people have benefited from that. So I commend it to you.
Well, good. Thank you. Please email me that name. What little I know from my colleagues in education policy, and they often are the ones talking about policy implementation being an improvisational process of emergence. So probably influenced by Kingdon, sure.
I was going to ask you a couple of questions. One is that, can you say something about the other part? I mean, there are very good words like active learning and problem-based learning. What are the possible problems there? What you might have the cons of going completely on that directions? And I will hear
Okay,
your
well, like I said, first of all, it's a challenge to do it well and right. So that's maybe the first thing. Even if, let's say, you're in a course at a level and a content area and a subject matter where this would be the most ideal method, there still are very many ways to not do it most effectively. So it's hard. It's hard to do it well. I do think there are some kinds of information that are best learned simply by information delivery, right? Whatever. Let's say it's the multiplication tables. I have a 10-year-old son, right? You don't need to sort of project-based learning to figure out the multiplication tables. You just need to memorize them. So, yeah, undeniably, there are certain bodies of knowledge that really you just need to have them delivered to you. I'm still not sure lecture is the right way. I mean, they can go on Wikipedia or they can read it in a book. But whatever method, there are some kinds of knowledge that probably don't need active project-based learning. So then it's tough. It's a matter of coming up with the right balance for your own subject area and the level of the students. And it's going to vary with different subject matter. So yes, I'm not a hater of information delivery as a necessary component of a learning environment. But I think there's a balance, and I think for the most part, most learning environments are out of balance towards information delivery, and not enough of the active problem-based learning.
I'm just curious what you're going to be teaching at UNC Chapel Hill. That would be one question. And then the other would be, I'm assuming you're going to apply what you're going to do what you say. So what
I practice what I preach.
Yes, yes, thank you. And what assessments will you use to ascertain that the students, in fact, have learned?
Well, good. That's like a softball question because I'm creating an MA program in innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship, which is going to be a 12-month program for master's students, where a huge component of it is going to be an internship in an educational venture, probably somewhere in the research triangle. So it's going to be very much active, and the class I'm going to teach them is really just going to be talking about their internship. So it's very much an apprentice internship model, which sort of naturally aligns with this. And I doubt I will ever lecture in that program.
Are you familiar with Destination Imagination or Odyssey of the Mind?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a program, it's a competition. It's like an activity like Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts, but it's a program that's done in elementary and high schools where kids work collaboratively to solve problems. There's often hands-on components, and it seems like it's made to order according to your, the precepts for generating creative thinking and building those skills.
Yes, you're exactly right. There are a lot of, I should add those to the little bit at the end where I talked about the future taking shape. Then there's the first robotics competition, which a lot of people have heard of. So there are lots of these efforts. They tend to be, I guess the thing that disappoints me a little bit is that they rarely are in the 9 to 3 classroom, right? They're these enrichment activities, and what goes on in the classroom is kind of the old stuff. So I would like to see high school teachers actually make their classes more like that. And it's happening. You go to, I spent a month at the Exploratorium, which is a legendary science center in San Francisco. They have a huge teacher professional development arm, probably a third of their staff, and very much an alternative model of pedagogy based on inquiry, scientific inquiry. So teachers are going there, and they're going through the professional development. So there are all sorts of, what do I say, I hate to say thousand flowers. In Washington, D.C., it has maybe different connotations. But there are all sorts of ways that the future is taking shape. And I guess it's the nature of innovation again. It's lots of small ideas. You've got Destination Imagination. You've got FIRST Robotics. You've got invent teams. You've got these learning scientists coming up with handheld PDAs. Now, since the first edition of the Learning Sciences Handbook was published in 2006, the landscape has changed dramatically. We didn't have MOOCs in 2006, right? We didn't have badges. We didn't have any of this. And now technology is coming into education, but it's coming in a way that, I guess, here's what I'm advocating in my conclusion to the second edition of the Learning Sciences Handbook, which I'm also editing. A lot of the technologies that are entering education are not grounded in learning sciences research. They're developed by technology people, and they're excited by the technology. And I guess I am too. I have an undergraduate degree in computer science. But it's not going to help if it's not grounded in the science of how people learn. And that's where I see missing a lot from educational technology. So that's why this new program I'm creating at University of North Carolina, I'm in the Learning Sciences program in the School of Education. And the vision there is that we do want these students to graduate and be capable of participating in educational innovation and entrepreneurship. But if they ground what they're doing in the science of how people learn, they'll be more likely to be successful and help our students.
I am very curious about hearing more about your discussion on assessment and evaluation. I'm in the School of Engineering, and I see many of my colleagues here. We are going through ABET accreditation, and in engineering, assessment of learning objectives means something very specific. And I'm not necessarily asking about that, but I am asking, maybe you can give some of your impressions of the current research about assessment of learning objectives, and maybe you can talk about your experiences both on how students view assessment in some of your classes or programs, and also how you have viewed your experiences in that. Because I don't think I saw that, and I think you kind of skipped over her question about that because she asked it on the end. And so I'm just very curious about that.
Well, I'm happy to talk about engineering. Actually, Professor Erickson was talking about medical education. Two of my biggest grants, I was co-PIs with professors in the computer science department at Washington University. And we got an NSF, what's called a CPATH-T grant to transform the undergraduate curriculum. I told you about the University of Colorado at Boulder. As a matter of fact, I would say ABET accreditation is, out of all of the professional schools, they're out in front in terms of getting behind learning sciences research and these kinds of learning outcomes. There was a report a couple of years ago called the Engineer of 2020 report, which 100% came down on the side of learning sciences-based learning environments, active, project-based learning. I believe the first sentence of that report was, engineering is a fundamentally creative profession, or something to that effect. I mean, they're all in with engineers. We're training them to create stuff, right? We're not just training them to regurgitate formula that we're teaching them in the classroom. So my impression is that ABET is actually leading the way, and that schools of education are, in the context of the university, they're maybe ahead of some of the other units on campus in terms of moving towards this kind of research-based model of pedagogy. Now, I don't have an answer for the assessment. You know, if I could look to my 2 years spent studying professional schools of art and design. I was at Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD, in Savannah. And then I did the same study at Washington University's Sam Fox School of Art and Design. And they assess student work very rigorously, even though it's creative work. But it's very time-consuming to do that form of assessment. There are peer panels. I'm not sure there's a way to do it right that's cheap and quick. I guess that's the challenge. How do you get cheap and quick and paper-based? That doesn't exist. And I'm not sure how you get there.
I'm going to toss something in just at the university level and thinking in part about engineering. At the university level, I think one of the better publications to take a look at is called Our Students' Best Work, which comes from the Association of American Colleges and Universities. And that's a lot of emphasis on the students doing what I would call a kind of a climax project, which is, to the extent that they can at that stage, putting together the pieces of what it is they're trying to learn. And in engineering, MIT was an early leader with Woody Flowers, and even freshman courses where students worked on design projects, which has the advantage, going back to what Professor Erickson said, I think when students are assessing that gives them insight into how they're doing, not just the faculty member, and a process of doing something which gives them joy at the same time. Joy and achievement, perhaps joy because of what they are, because the practice that they're beginning to engage in, whatever the field is, reading a novel or creating something in engineering and investigation, because it's a continuing challenge for us. And we talked about this earlier, about processes that get the student more and more motivated to be working hard. You know, the creative jolt that you get is one of the sources of that kind of motivation. I think there are a lot of points of correspondence in the two talks that have a lot to suggest about engineering. I think we got time for one more question.
Yeah, I wondered if you could just mention a bit of or address this sort of tension between content and, if you like, skills, and essentially you're teaching them a skill in this approach. And I think it's especially in the context of engineering, there's a lot of content that they need to make those creative things. And I think a lot of times as faculty, we're afraid that we're going to miss teaching them something that could be really done efficiently in a lecture environment. We give them all the knowledge and then they can go out and do something with it. It's like that drawer of bike parts I have in my basement. Every once in a while I find something in it that I can use on my bike, but a lot of that stuff will be there for 30 years. But can you talk a little bit about how that's addressed in these approaches, maybe specifically to engineering education?
Right, right. Well, all the research shows that the sort of lecturing, filling up people with content just in case they might need it at some point in the future is not an effective pedagogical strategy. Mostly they don't remember it. Sometimes it's one of my learning sciences colleagues call it just in case model of pedagogy, right? We need to teach them all this just in case they might need it someday. And then contrasted that with just-in-time learning. And this is what I think is more grounded in learning sciences research. You're engaged in a real-world project. You hit a situation where you need to know something. You're going to go get it somehow. You're going to interact with the professor. You're going to go on Wikipedia. If you're building something, maybe it's a part, like working on your bicycle. You'll get it, you'll use it, and you will retain and remember that. So if you could make that happen, maybe you'll agree that would be better if your students could get that content knowledge embedded in the process of actually doing something in a real-world, authentic, complex manner. And then, yes, you're right. The challenge is maybe not every student will get everything because different students are working on different projects because they're all creating their own thing. So some students are going to learn one little pocket of content, and maybe another group of students might learn a different pocket of content. And what you end up with is almost like a customized educational experience for each of your learners. For the most part, I think learning scientists actually are not unhappy about that. That if different learners are getting customized experiences, It's almost part of what Professor Erickson was talking about. It often gets referred to in an education sector as adaptive learning environments, where the learning environment adapts to where each learner is. And every learner is going to be in a different place, even in a classroom of 10 people or 20 people. They really need a different learning environment, each one of them. But that's humanly impossible for an instructor to create a customized learning experience for each student if you are the center of attention and the lecturer. So how do you do that? How do you create that adaptive experience? A lot of the excitement out there in the media is with new technologies, because technology is capable of adapting how you present information in the user interface based on how the user is interacting with the software. But then you have the same questions. In this kind of improvisational, constructivist learning environment, it might be the case that different learners would acquire different things. We have a lot of concern, I think more so in the United States than in other countries that are beating us in the international competitions for test scores. We have a lot of concern with coverage in the United States, and it's been criticized pretty roundly. The phrase that sometimes gets used is, by the way, I'm not saying this is you anymore. I'm making a bigger point now. The phrase that sometimes gets used is that we have a curriculum that's a mile wide and an inch deep. And our students are learning, like one comparison with Japanese mathematics classrooms, where they beat us in international test scores. They apparently cover about 1/3 of what our students cover in their math classes. And yet, even though the international tests include questions on the parts that they didn't cover, because I've asked Jim Stigler, who works on the TIMSS assessment, so he's confirmed this, they're still outscoring us. So I guess it's a bigger point that I think the concern with coverage is hard to reconcile. I guess I'm agreeing with you. It's hard to reconcile with the kind of pedagogies I'm advocating. But maybe we don't need to be so concerned with coverage. But that's a bigger question. I mean, we can argue about that for the rest of the day, I guess. So thank you so much. I've enjoyed being here, and I'll be around for lunch if you have any questions.
Dennis? Dennis Chaffee for a final word.
I think one thing you've learned today, if you didn't already know, is that teaching well is hard work. And the Teaching and Learning Collaborative can help you with that. We've got designers. I just want to point out that we're starting a walk-in service. You can go into the ITL. I think it's 4 days a week. You can also go to our website and ask for a consultation. And I hope you overload us with requests, and then we'll go ask for more money and continue to improve teaching and learning. I thank the TLC staff. I want to single out Ms. Cassandra Wiseman, who took responsibility for this day. Thank you again for coming, and see you next year.